The first letter arrived folded beneath the windshield wiper of his truck, tucked neatly beneath the spring sun, as if it had simply blown there by chance. Printed on thick paper, professionally formatted, it bore the unmistakable tone of authority. Notice of violation. It read in bold letters, followed by a list of seemingly petty offenses: improper lawn edging, unapproved fence color, and a non-regulation mailbox. The fines totaled nearly $1,100. Due immediately. He stood there in the driveway, the paper fluttering slightly in the breeze, and laughed out loud. It was an honest reaction, part disbelief, part irritation, and part amusement. Because he didn't belong to any HOA. His house sat on the corner of an older street annexed decades ago, a section never included in the neighborhood's governing documents. That fact had been confirmed when he bought the house 3 years earlier. But as he'd come to learn, facts didn't matter much when someone with power decided otherwise. Karen Whitmore had been the HOA president for 6 years, and in that time, she'd turned what had once been a simple group of neighbors maintaining property standards into a pseudo-government with its own twisted logic and codebook. People whispered her name at block parties. Some feared her. Others tolerated her. A few had moved away to escape her constant scrutiny and threats. Most kept their heads down. He didn't. That wasn't his nature. To most of the community, he was just a quiet man who kept to himself. He mowed his lawn, waved politely, never caused trouble. But what they didn't know, what Karen certainly hadn't known, was that he was a U.S. Marshal. A federal officer trained to navigate the criminal underworld, root out deception, and apply the law with precision. He hadn't listed his position on the deed. Hadn't introduced himself as anything other than a government employee. That anonymity had always served him well. Until now. At first, he dismissed the citation as a mistake. A paperwork error. But then, the notices kept coming. 1 for unauthorized exterior lighting. Another for improperly stored refuse containers. Each arrived with threats of legal action. Then came the emails, strangely formal but riddled with typos, all signed from the HOA's Enforcement Division. The problem was, there was no such division. He sent an email asking for clarification, and was told he'd have to appear at an arbitration hearing to resolve his violations. The date was set. The location was unusual, a rented storefront, far from the HOA's usual meeting room at the library. That raised red flags. He went. Not because he feared the outcome, but because he needed to see who was behind this. The room was set up like a courtroom, complete with a folding table at the front draped in navy cloth, a fake seal pin behind it. Karen sat in the center, flanked by 2 men in matching suits, who he instantly recognized as actors, too stiff, too rehearsed. They introduced themselves as arbitrators, though neither offered credentials. "We're here to settle your violations," Karen said, smiling thinly. "I don't live in the HOA," he replied. Karen handed him a document, supposedly a revised zoning map that, according to her, had been updated recently. It was a forgery. A poor one. "This is a federal crime," he said, scanning it. "You can dispute it," she offered. "But if you refuse compliance, our legal team will move forward." He left without saying another word. That night, he started his investigation. Using federal databases, public property records, and surveillance from discrete sources, he traced Karen's network. What he found shocked him. Karen had filed over 200 property liens in the past 18 months. Nearly 30 homeowners had lost property, many through quiet seizures backed by default judgments from a local magistrate. That judge, it turned out, had a personal connection to Karen's family. She had been feeding him falsified documents, and he'd been signing off on them without review. Worse, Karen had established a shadow enforcement arm, hired men posing as HOA officers, some dressed in knockoff police gear, others with fake court orders, delivering threats of arrest or eviction. Most of her victims were elderly, or first-time homeowners. Many paid the fines, afraid to push back. He couldn't ignore it. Over the next several weeks, he compiled a detailed report and looped in the U.S. Attorney's Office. With their support, he began recording every interaction, documenting every threat, and creating a trap. He baited Karen into scheduling another arbitration hearing, this time, involving a fabricated set of violations supposedly related to zoning changes. She couldn't resist. Her arrogance had become her weakness. On the day of the hearing, he walked into the same storefront. The actors were back. Karen was there, smiling wider than before. "This is your final opportunity," she warned. He nodded, and then gestured. The back door opened. Federal agents poured into the room. Real officers, with real badges and real warrants. Karen was handcuffed before she could stand. Her 2 arbitrators froze, caught in the shock. The charges were read aloud: wire fraud, impersonation of law enforcement, conspiracy to commit extortion, unlawful property seizure, and falsification of legal documents. Karen's face crumbled as the realization sank in. The hearing had been staged, but not by her. By him. Outside, more agents fanned out across the neighborhood. Search warrants were executed. The judge's office was raided. Laptops, hard drives, financial records, all confiscated. The news hit the following day. Local headlines ran with cautious language, but online, the story exploded. A corrupt HOA president arrested in a sting by a U.S. Marshal? It was irresistible, but the real impact came weeks later. The HOA collapsed. Its board members resigned. A state investigation was launched. The judge stepped down and was later indicted. Karen, after a brief and humiliating trial, was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison. Most of the properties she'd stolen were returned. Homeowners who had paid bogus fines were issued refunds through restitution. The house was quiet again. Peaceful. But it wasn't just the end of harassment. It was the restoration of truth. Justice didn't always come with flashing lights or courtroom drama. Sometimes it came from patience, preparation, and an unshakable belief in the law. He never boasted. Never told the full story to his neighbors. Most still knew him as the quiet man at the end of the street, and that was fine with him. Because power, real power, never needed to shout. The neighborhood slowly began to breathe again in the weeks following Karen's arrest. There was no dramatic transformation, no confetti or celebration, just a strange kind of collective exhale. Homeowners who had lived under the cloud of her false authority began to emerge from their guarded routines. Lawns were mowed without fear of inspection. Kids rode their bikes a little farther. Front doors stayed open longer. It was as if an invisible weight had been lifted, though no one quite knew how to explain it. He kept to his habits. Coffee at dawn, walks around the perimeter of his modest backyard, and a quiet nod to the mail carrier, who now made the rounds without slipping envelopes that reeked of intimidation. Some neighbors began to approach him cautiously. They didn't know the full story, only that he'd somehow been involved in taking Karen down. Whispers had circulated, some accurate, most exaggerated. A few thought he was ex-military, others guessed he was a private investigator. Only one guessed correctly. She was a widow in her early 60s, living 2 houses down. She'd never spoken to him before the arrest. But one afternoon, she brought over a plate of lemon bars and a handwritten note. It said simply, "Thank you for not letting her scare us anymore." He didn't need acknowledgement. But the note stayed on his kitchen counter for weeks. The investigation into Karen's scheme continued far beyond what most of the neighborhood ever learned. Federal prosecutors discovered bank accounts under shell company names. One account, tied to a consulting firm Karen had created on paper only, held over $800,000, money collected through bogus liens, fraudulent fines, and property seizures. She had, in effect, turned the HOA into a personal extortion racket disguised as community enforcement. But the most disturbing revelations weren't financial. They were psychological. During questioning, it became clear that Karen had studied the homeowners in her neighborhood meticulously. She had files on dozens of them, personal histories, property values, past legal issues, family details. Her harassment had been targeted, not random. She preyed on those least likely to push back: the elderly, single mothers, recent immigrants, and young couples just beginning to establish roots. Her power had grown not through brute force, but through fear, confusion, and the illusion of legal authority. That tactic, leveraging pseudo-legal threats, was what had made her operation so effective. The envelopes, the badges, the paperwork printed on high-quality stock with vague but intimidating wording, all of it was designed to mimic legitimate bureaucracy. And most people, when faced with official-looking demands, don't challenge them. They comply. That insight weighed heavily on him. Because if someone like Karen could build a small empire on fear and forged documents, what might others be doing on a larger scale? It wasn't just a local HOA issue. It was a warning about how easily authority can be faked, and how vulnerable people are when they feel isolated. After Karen's sentencing, he was invited to speak at a closed session held by a coalition of state lawmakers considering HOA reform. He didn't give a speech. He didn't want to become a talking head or a symbol. But he did provide a written statement, a detailed account of the tactics Karen used, and the legal loopholes she exploited. He titled it, "Authority by Appearance." It circulated quietly among city planners, housing attorneys, and state officials. Eventually, it made its way into training materials for law enforcement officers and county clerks. HOA boards across the state were required to submit more transparent budgets, clearly outline enforcement authority, and provide residents with independent review options. It was a small ripple, but a meaningful one. He went back to work. His duties as a U.S. Marshal remained demanding. He didn't tell many people in the office what had happened. There was no need. His reports spoke for themselves. But there was one quiet moment in a hallway when a colleague passed him and said simply, "Nice job on the neighborhood thing." He nodded, and they kept walking. But despite the quiet victory, he remained watchful. One afternoon, months later, a car parked at the end of a street. Dark windows. Engine running. The driver didn't get out. Just sat there. After 10 minutes, he walked casually past it, noted the plates, and logged the time. The car left soon after. He didn't chase it. Didn't draw attention. But the next morning, he ran the plates and traced them back to a former property firm Karen had worked with. One that had recently gone out of business after being named in the federal case. He didn't tell anyone. Just made a note. Because even after a fire is put out, there are always embers. He installed a second set of security lights. Updated the cameras. And added 2 new encrypted drives to his home system. One for neighborhood records, the other for incident tracking. He wasn't paranoid. He was prepared. Not because he expected another Karen, but because he understood now that corruption doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it knocks politely, hands you a neatly folded letter, and asks you to comply. And he would never be caught off guard again. In the months that followed the dismantling of Karen Whitmore's HOA empire, the neighborhood evolved. But so did he. No longer just a man with a badge and a quiet sense of duty, he had become something else. An anchor, a reminder of what happens when power is abused and justice is delayed. But he didn't see himself that way. For him, it wasn't about justice as an abstract concept. It was about peace. Restoration. Making sure no one else woke up to a fraudulent notice taped to their door. What most people didn't understand about power was how seductive it could be, not only to those who hold it, but to those around them. People liked order. They liked rules. They liked someone to blame when things went wrong, even if that someone was innocent. Karen had understood that. She hadn't built her scheme on brute force. She'd built it on suggestion, on legitimacy by repetition. Her fines weren't random. They were precise, tailored. Her hearings weren't legal, but they looked official enough to make people second-guess their own understanding of the law. And that was what made her dangerous. But once the illusion shattered, it didn't just break, it collapsed. The community, long silenced by passive fear, began to speak up. A homeowner on the east side of the neighborhood came forward with records going back 2 years. Every payment they'd made to the HOA, every notice they'd received. None of it lined up with the official documentation on file with the county. A retired schoolteacher found a series of checks she'd written that had been deposited into an account under a completely unrelated LLC, another shell linked to Karen. These weren't accidents. These were choices, calculated and sustained over time. The investigation widened. The U.S. Attorney's Office began looking into Karen's other ventures. She'd served on 2 nonprofit boards, both tied to community revitalization, grants that mysteriously disappeared after being issued. She'd helped organize a local improvement district with expanded beautification authority, one that had somehow absorbed unzoned properties into its boundaries without the property owner's consent. It became clear that Karen hadn't simply manipulated a neighborhood. She'd weaponized governance. The fraud spanned more than fake violations. It was structural. Sophisticated. She had mapped human behavior as carefully as a predator watches a herd. She knew who would resist, who would fold, who would pay quietly, who might call a lawyer. She had anticipated reactions and preempted them with paperwork, threats, or public shaming. In court, one of her victims described the experience this way. It wasn't the fines that hurt the most. It was how alone she made you feel. Like no one would believe you. Like you were the crazy one. That was the heart of her strategy, isolation, which made the Marshal's intervention not just important, it made it revolutionary, because it proved that someone was watching. That silence wasn't the only option. His own role remained mostly in the background. He never testified publicly. His contribution was treated as law enforcement intelligence, privileged, protected, but word spread. Not just in his neighborhood, but in others. Stories began to surface from nearby towns. Similar HOA disputes, sudden liens mystery, compliance visits. His inbox began to fill with messages, not from reporters, but from victims. People asking for advice. People asking if they were next. He responded when he could. Never with legal advice, that wasn't his role, but with one thing few others could offer, clarity. He helped them understand what to look for. Vague language and violation notices, arbitrations held outside legitimate venues, threats of enforcement without judicial review. He pointed out how Karen used quasi-legal jargon to give weight to nonsense, how she mimicked court formatting to make her notices seem official, and in doing so, he helped others reclaim their agency. Eventually, a quiet group of attorneys, some working pro bono, some through housing advocacy networks, formed a coalition. Their goal was simple, to establish a centralized database of HOA enforcement abuse. They called it Flagstone. He wasn't listed as a founder, but he was its earliest and most consistent contributor. Flagstone grew fast. Within 6 months, it had documented more than 700 cases across 14 states involving HOA overreach, fraud, or abuse. Some were minor. Others were nearly identical to Karen's scheme. All were troubling. He reviewed the entries late at night, sometimes with a sense of grim resolve, other times with fatigue. There were too many. Too much silence. Too many lives disrupted by people who had learned how to disguise greed as order. But he kept working. Kept reading. Kept logging. His own home, once a target of manipulation, had become a fortress, not of walls, but of knowledge. He installed a secure data node in his garage, backed up weekly, connected to Flagstone and other decentralized networks. His camera system, already advanced, had grown into a multi-tiered system designed to monitor not just trespassers, but patterns, who showed up, how often, in what vehicles, and whether they were repeat visitors tied to flag groups. He didn't live in fear. He lived in readiness, because one thing Karen had taught him, something that stayed long after the courtroom verdict, was that corruption doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes, it arrives with a handshake and a clipboard. One fall evening he stood at the edge of his backyard beneath a sky streaked with orange and slate-gray clouds. The wind tugged gently at the leaves, and somewhere a neighbor's dog barked once, then fell silent. It was quiet, the kind of quiet you didn't get in cities, the kind you couldn't buy, only earn. And he understood, as he often did in moments like this, just how fragile that quiet could be. The case was over. The headlines had moved on. But peace wasn't permanent. It had to be defended, not with hostility or paranoia, but with vigilance and clarity. That's why he'd stayed. He received offers, consulting positions, lectures, even a book deal. One publisher offered a 6-figure advance if he'd tell his story. But he turned them down. It wasn't his story anymore. It belonged to the dozens of homeowners who had lost years of savings, the elderly couple who nearly lost their home over a $300 weeds violation, the young family forced to delay a move after Karen filed an illegal lien. His job had never been about attention. It was about accountability, and that's what he taught others to look for. Not justice as a sweeping, dramatic spectacle, but as a daily act. Knowing your rights. Questioning authority when it oversteps. Demanding proof. Filing the paperwork. Reading the bylaws. Educating your neighbors. Recording the conversation. In that sense, Karen had done more than run a scam. She had triggered a reckoning. Not all homeowners associations were corrupt. He'd worked with plenty that did things right. Transparent finances, regular elections, clear communication. But what Karen proved was how easy it was for a single person to weaponize structure when no one was watching. That was what haunted him most. She hadn't needed guns. Or hackers. Or mercenaries. She needed a printer, a title, and an empty meeting room. And that was enough to cause chaos. When new neighbors moved in down the block, a couple from out of state, quiet, polite, he made a point to bring over a small welcome gift. Nothing extravagant. A candle, a handwritten note, a list of emergency contacts and neighborhood resources. He included one other thing, a copy of the HOA's original incorporation map, the one that proved, without question, which homes fell within its jurisdiction. They read it, thanked him, said no one else had ever mentioned it before. He smiled. Most people don't bring it up until it's a problem. That was the point. Stop the problem before it grows. His home, once the site of legal threats and fake citations, was now a quiet note of defense, not against crime, but against confusion, coercion, and the slow erosion of rights that often passes unnoticed until it's too late. And as he sat on his porch that night, watching the sky darken and the streetlights flicker on, he felt something deeper than relief. He felt certainty. That what he had done mattered. That standing firm, even silently, can ripple out in ways no one anticipates. That justice isn't always about trials and sentences. Sometimes, it's about the neighbor who no longer feels afraid to plant the garden they want, the child who can ride their bike without someone photographing their yard, the man or woman who opens a letter and knows they don't have to pay, because now, they know better. He'd given them that, not just protection, but clarity, and that, he thought as the first stars appeared overhead, was enough. Months passed without incident. For most, life returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could come after such a rupture. The neighborhood settled into a rhythm again, not because it forgot what happened, but because it had finally processed it. Fear no longer whispered between fences. Instead, a kind of quiet determination had taken its place, yet he never stopped watching. Patterns had a way of repeating, especially when left unchecked. So when he noticed a real estate developer making quiet moves in the adjacent subdivision, snapping up lots, attending zoning meetings, lobbying city officials under the radar, his instincts stirred. Not alarm, not yet, but awareness. He dug deeper. The development firm was legitimate on paper, but its lead strategist had once sat on the board of a company linked to one of Karen's abandoned shell entities. There was no crime, no direct connection, just a familiar stench. He took note. Logged the transactions. Created a fresh case file. The difference now was that he wasn't alone. Others had become watchers too. A neighbor who used to work in real estate flagged as suspicious. Code review, update quietly added to the county website. A woman 2 streets over, a librarian with a talent for digital archives, began cross-referencing permit requests with HOA boundary maps. They brought him what they found, and he helped verify it. Together, they built a firewall, not a brick, but a people. Informed, connected, alert. Because what Karen had proven, and what they all now understood, was that corruption doesn't just live in dramatic headlines. It lives in the unnoticed. The footnotes. The bylaws that no one reads. The temporary rules, that somehow become permanent. The new committee formed with vague purpose and broad authority. But they were ready. What had started as one man standing up to a paper tyrant had become something larger, a community that no longer ceded its rights by default. Not because they were rebellious, but because they had learned that freedom, like property, is something you have to maintain. He looked out over his street one morning, clean, quiet, ordinary. Just as it should be. And in that moment, he felt what he had always hoped to feel, not just safety, but permanence.